Good afternoon. I'm Jana Martin, Chief Executive Officer of the American Insurance Trust, known to most of you simply as the Trust. We are delighted that you're able to join us virtually today for the next webinar in our virtual webinar series. The Trust is pleased to be able to offer this informative content free of charge to our policyholders. The Trust is pleased to once again partner with Drs. Margot Adams-Larson and Sarah Smarker-Barnwell to present these telehealth community chats. In the interest of time, we've placed their bios on a slide for you. This virtual webinar will earn you 1 CE credit. This can be combined with 5 other Trust continuing education credits to save up to 15% on your Trust-sponsored professional liability insurance policy. As always, please remember to submit your CE certificates with your policy renewal. I hope everyone learns a lot over the next hour. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed presenters.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Martin. It's just a pleasure to be here again. And Sarah, I'm so excited to chat with you. We've got a number of different conversations that we've been gathering along the way through the week, and also from all the questions and answers that came in last time that we didn't quite get to as well. I'm super excited to see some of the new content coming in and questions that folks have for us today. We always start with some disclosures, so I'll just briefly review those. Sarah and I do a lot of training on telepsychology and telehealth practices, and just kind of as a reminder, the content that we'll share is certainly the information that we've gathered from lots of different resources and lots of colleagues around actually around the globe at this point, but they don't necessarily reflect the specific information from the Trust. We always encourage reaching out and contacting the Trust advocates for your very specific situation and scenarios to make sure that you're getting your questions answered there as well. We are enthusiasts for telehealth, and certainly hope to bring you just a good, practical, down-to-earth review of information and answers to the questions that you have. As well, anytime we talk about technology, I always like to make sure that Murphy's Law is covered, which means if we talk about it, it's probably going to fail or something weird is going to happen, and we'll just embrace it and go with it. And just like Dr. Martin mentioned, some of our studios are having some bad weather today, so who knows, it could be that. But I'm just so thrilled to introduce Dr. Sarah Smarker-Barnwell to tell us a little bit more about what we're going to do for the next hour.
Well, we're going to have a little bit of a change today as we discuss, Margot. I think we're going to give it a try that, as questions come in, depending on the volume of questions that we receive, we may take a moment to pause going through a few of our agenda items and then taking a break to answer some questions. As Dr. Martin mentioned, we may not always be able to get to every questions, but we will do our level best. And then, we'll sort of take it as it comes. But our hope is to pause in several spaces today to just be sure that folks feel that we are answering their questions and keeping that engagement and that interest, hopefully.
All right. Well, I am going to kick it off with a topic that keeps coming up in our questions in all sorts of forms and shapes and sizes, and that's interjurisdictional telehealth. I'm also going to stop sharing the screen so we can have a bit more of a context of seeing each other as we're chatting. I'll start off this question by throwing a question back out to everybody who's listening, and that is, when you're conducting video conferencing sessions, do you ask the physical location of where your patient client is located at the time? And I just toss that out as a thinker question, because we get a lot of questions about interjurisdictional telehealth. Specifically, here's a great example question. where can I find the exact link to determine if I can do telehealth with a patient that's in another jurisdiction? Sometimes it comes in the form of, I'm in this jurisdiction and my patient's in a different jurisdiction. Can I do telehealth? And it seems like it should be a really simple answer, or at least we're looking for a simple answer. And unfortunately, there is no exact one place. It's a very complicated question. And I'm hoping to give a little bit of a response that helps guide you as the listener to have a sense of a few steps to take in order to figure out if you can determine an answer to the question that you're asking of, can I do telehealth from this place to a client in another location jurisdictionally? The very first place that I would recommend going is the ASPPB website. We've posted those links on the resource slide, but ASPPB is able to link you, or you can find in their website direct links to all the jurisdictional websites for licensing boards in psychology. And they may not be the same name as the psychology licensing board in your jurisdiction. Sometimes they're the Board of Psychology, sometimes they're the Board of Psychologist Examiners, sometimes they're under a different Board of Behavioral Health. So it's helpful to go to that, go to the ASPPB website to then look at the state or jurisdiction that your patient client, I'm not going to keep saying those, but however you think of the person you're providing care to, whatever jurisdiction they're in, you want to find out the information from that website. You could also and should also go to the CSG website, which we provided that link on the slide as well. And this is the site where you can look up the different executive orders that are happening that have either been in place, might have already expired, might be continuing, might be set to expire, because the executive orders during COVID are another factor that you need to consider as to whether you may or may not be allowed to do telepractice to somebody in a different jurisdiction based on that other jurisdiction as well as your own. Certainly you want to know your own licensing board's requirements and or permissions regarding telehealth to somebody outside of your jurisdiction. And those requirements may be very different to the ones that allow you to do telepractice within your jurisdiction. So you want to make sure you're asking very particular questions if you're looking for that information on their website or you're contacting them. The same is true, you'd want to ask those very same things and look for that knowledge and information in the other jurisdiction regarding crossing the state lines coming in to do telepractice or to a patient receiving services from outside of their jurisdiction. Those are all the kinds of legal steps that you might want to get resources on. And there's one final one that I would really encourage folks to look at, and that's the insurance provider. If insurance is covering this service, you're going to want to look at that facet of what's going on as well. So that might also be dependent on an executive order. It might not. But you want to contact the insurance company to find out if they're going to continue to either cover the care or allow you to start coverage for that kind of care outside of the jurisdiction that you're licensed in. And so by law, you may be able to do all of this, but the insurance company might actually say, if you don't have a license in that other jurisdiction, then you can't bill for it or you can't receive payment.
I feel like this is something of the train we see coming down the tracks. And for me, it really gets intersectional with themes of ethical abandonment when I think about my APA ethics code. And as much as I may initiate care with a client, perhaps within my own jurisdiction or across jurisdictions if I'm permitted to do so. But the executive orders that have facilitated insurance reimbursement may have an expiration date.
Yeah.
And so if I have begun care with them under one set of legal circumstances requiring their coverage, it is an unknown. So I can start care, we can be in the throes of good care, and, the insurance situation might change. And it's my, as we're both telehealth enthusiasts. So it is my sincere hope that insurance still sees value in this and want to maintain this for its membership. But many of these executive orders, as you've taught me, Margot, are there as an interstitial measure while legislature changes regulation. And if that doesn't happen, they expire and things may go back. And so for me, I'm thinking about this a lot with clients that I'm just starting with now, those new clients. I'm really checking on those executive orders, first of all, just so that I could be permitted to practice where they are, especially for my clients who have traveled to quarantine at home with a family member. And, then additionally, the financial aspect of could they continue care practically. It's something that I'm thinking about, I'm writing about in my informed consent document, and I'm sort of trying to plan for in advance so I don't get caught unawares.
And it's such a great point you make, Sarah, that these are all extremely important, transparent conversations to have with patients as you are either transitioning care to the telepractice model if they're in a different jurisdiction, or as an ongoing conversation. And like you said, making sure you've got that documentation in place as well.
Always document, yeah.
It's such a big question. It's an awesome question to be asking, and we should always be asking this question. It's just so very complicated, and as much as we want to kind of leap in and make sure we're covering care, we also want to do our due diligence in realizing it's a very complicated issue.
Well, Margot, we had talked about stopping a little earlier today and taking some questions. We've received some great questions. So I'm wondering, shall I read one or two, and then we'll take a few moments, and then we'll hold forth some more with those previously submitted questions and do it that way.
That sounds fantastic.
Okay. So I'm just going to go in some of the order I've received. From an ethical perspective, when does the therapy session start, especially if we are having trouble connecting due to technical problems? For example, we send the client the link at the appointment and we have trouble connecting for several minutes. How do I bill the session regarding length of appointment? I think this is a great question, and one that's really sticky. And I'm going to give my thought on it, and then Margot, you want to?
Yeah.
So generally speaking, I treat it very much like someone, not arriving late due to traffic. It wasn't their fault. They didn't do anything wrong, and we're not at the appointment at the time. Now, I want to acknowledge, I'm going to tell you practically, anecdotally, let's take what just happened to me a few moments ago. I just got off and I don't know what happened with my internet, but I was able to get right back on. An interruption like that, if I'm really transparent, I'm going to chalk up to just being, the wacky things that happen in telehealth. And I actually would not be prone to count that as an interruption to therapy. If, however, someone is really having trouble connecting, let's say they've just had terrible internet troubles, or maybe they're new to the modality and aren't necessarily as facile as they could be with technology. We're starting 10 minutes late, 15 minutes late, 20 minutes late. Those are a moment where I might bill it as a 90834, a 45-minute session, instead of a 90837, a 60-minute session. Now, in my informed consent document, I have addressed this issue in advance. I'll tell you my general policy, much as if someone were late to my office, is if there is more than a 20-minute delay, or we're losing more than 20 minutes of appointment time, then I look to reschedule. I'll admit I'm very permissive with my rescheduling in the days of COVID and internet demands. I used to be a real stickler about having a late fee. Now, if I can reschedule you within the week, I do so. I think it is very challenging to know from whence the technology derives, the problem derives. Is it their problem? Is it the product I'm using's problem? Is it my problem? I think it is hard to discern. So I tend to err on the side of not being punitive because I think it's good for clinical rapport. And honestly, I just don't feel that I could always ascertain the nature of the problem. So I would say little interruptions, I regard the therapy as having started. That's okay. If we're looking at a longer delay, I treat it like when someone's late to my office in person, and either I'm billing it as a shorter appointment or I'm rescheduling it. And I want to acknowledge that I may have a policy that I might be billing it as a shorter appointment, but I may have hold my client financially liable for that time. That's a personal decision, that should go into the informed consent document. My personal practice is I don't, but I'm a softie, so I'm not saying people should emulate me in this way. Some people do. Some people say, hey, that's the way it goes, and you have to pay for your hour. But personally, I think that most of the time it's just things that are really outside my client's control, and so I tend not to. How about you, Margot? How do you handle this one?
Yeah, I think my tendency is to model it very much the same way as a regular in-person appointment time. When this is a pattern that I observe over time, that is a whole other aspect that I might take into consideration and be thinking about this as, I always see them at 1:00 and they're never on until 1:15, or they're trying to get on and can't get on. And, that might be something to consider. However, I say 1:00 specifically because that does actually tend to be a very difficult time for any phone calling bridges, conference lines, and Zoom as a very common time that people start meetings. And so, as you pointed out, the internet is just very busy. So it could literally be that they're just always scheduled at a time that's a very busy time. And it isn't their fault necessarily. But then I would look to just further evaluating, is it a common issue? And I would address that more clinically. Of course, having the documentation and the transparent discussions ahead of time in how you run your practice. And I think I've heard too from colleagues, it's much easier on the video conferencing to have a very tight schedule, it seems, because people seem to be a little bit more in tune with those scheduled times. But if folks are late or running late, and depending on their circumstances, I think we do have to have that kind of clinical consideration as to what the challenge might be.
I have one more. I think it's a really good one, and then we can.
Awesome.
We do have some great ones here. This is one I'm super interested in. It says, I'm planning to give up my office and work from home permanently. What are some of the considerations? For example, will some insurance not pay for teletherapy? Will my home address be revealed? Do I need a PO box address for my mail? So this is all great questions. I'll give you, Margot, do you want me to take a stab at it first, or do you want to jump in?
How about I jump in quick, because I'll say there's a few considerations, and I know this is one that you've actually got a lot of experience with. So I guess my considerations would really be more centered to the practitioner, actually, because I think what you're going to say a little bit. And that is thinking about the balance of your home life. That's something that I've kind of toggled with on and off. The balance of your ability with your family and kind of home life and who's around, and that might not be an issue, but there's HIPAA compliant office space setting that we do want to consider. And if those are all things you've already considered, then I think really it has a lot more to do with the practicality aspects. And Sarah, I'll let you talk about kind of the background side.
I wholeheartedly agree with those points. I would add a few more too. I think, even if holding constant the idea that, we could attain a good work-life balance, and that, I like to call it the undifferentiated miasma of my time these days in the world of COVID. For me, I'm thinking about some additional themes. I'd want to know some things about your jurisdiction. So in some jurisdictions, there actually are requirements to see clients initially in person, to have, certain documentation done in person. I think that is probably going to go the way of the dodo, is my opinion. And I believe that many states have issued regulation that allows us to set this aside during COVID. I don't know if that will be maintained, or if this, like many other executive orders, will expire. So I would first want to know about your jurisdiction. I'll tell you anecdotally, if you decided to do this 100%, I would encourage you to still think about where you would go if you wanted to see a client in person. And this is why. We know that telehealth appropriateness, and this is in our prior talks, if anybody wants to go back and relive the old days with us. Telehealth appropriateness is an ongoing assessment. I may determine that someone is appropriate for telehealth at one point, and yet in the future decide that they are not. Now, if I have an exclusively telehealth practice, that determination that they are not appropriate for telehealth would likely result in a referral to another colleague. And if that client is, under some emergent circumstances, if I'm very concerned about their well-being and I'm not comfortable seeing them over telehealth at this time, again, understanding there's no data-driven reason that there's not one client that we just never see over telehealth. But I will tell you, I like the idea that you know where you would go, because I can say in my career, I love telehealth. I don't have a lot of exclusion criteria, and there have been some circumstances that I'm just not comfortable doing it for various reasons, either because of the clinical stability of my client, because something going on in my home environment, remodels and things like that, something where I would like a place to go. And so in those instances, I think it has been valuable to know where I could go. So sometimes it's a colleague's office that someone can sublet on an as needed basis. WeWork has at various times had COVID, Freudian slip, HIPAA compliant sort of documentation that you could sign. I think those are a little problematic, if I'm entirely honest, but someplace that you could go that would be conducive to a healthcare appointment, that would have the privacy and confidentiality that we have come to expect in healthcare, knowing where you would go and not just being like, oh no, I'm scrambling to find something. That being said, I do encourage folks to contemplate whether or not they want mail sent to the home, because I do think if you are having folks send you physical documentation, inevitably that will be revealed. If you are doing your office entirely electronically and you're not ever sending paperwork back and forth, then the only place you're going to potentially be revealing your home address would be to an insurance company. And again, that's a question. Do you want that mail coming to your house? Typically, insurance will post the address of the provider on their directories. So it's another way in which your home address could be discovered. So these would be the themes, I would think about. Let's see.
I was just going to add one other thing that you mentioned there, and that is if you're moving into your home to do an entire, I'll say, digital practice, one of the things you may not realize giant value of having an office where there are a few colleagues, not just to have a location to go when there is something that you might need to see a patient for in person. It's also having the colleagues there. And while you might not want them around all the time, having them there once in a while or just to say hi, that's a huge factor in our own mental health and our own just balance of the work and what we do. And so I think it's easy in the times of COVID to live in our little bubble, but giving up an office of colleagues where it's just actually somebody to say hello or to kind of hear about how their day is really a huge value. And you don't necessarily have that experience in the same way when you're a solo video conferencing practice.
I agree. I actually recently, just in the last few months, I started a consult group that's telehealth only, and we have our teleconsult group every 2 weeks just to discuss cases. Because I used to have that curbside consultation. I'd see a colleague getting coffee, and I'd say, like, what do you think about this? In a PHI compliant, anonymized way. But in doing that, I think it improved my practice and helped me, stay on top of it. Also, there's one additional part of that question I'll mention, that was insurance. To my knowledge, I have not run into insurance having a problem with the home office, as long as it is an appropriate office space for healthcare. They don't seem to take issue with that I am aware of.
What they may have more struggle with is the patient not having a healthcare facility to be receiving the video conferencing in.
Depending where you live and what sort of insurance is required to cover, yes. But if you're doing telehealth to the home and that's permitted, very rarely, because you use that place of service code 02, it's not differentiated beyond that. It just knows it's a telehealth appointment, and that's sort of, they don't really care what type of office you have.
Okay. These are some awesome questions.
So good. And there's so many more good ones. I'm going to cover, some of the material that were previously submitted questions because, and here's, a little bit of a tell, but they're the items on the evaluation, so we got to tell folks. Okay. We received some great questions in this prior week. I really appreciated that had to do with when is it telehealth? And I think this is a really fascinating question. client reaches out to me over email, and really it's, they found my email somewhere and they say, I want to come in for therapy, and they are putting a lot of clinical information in that email. Is that telehealth? Let's say I've had an intake session with someone and they're calling me in between sessions because they think they forgot their hairbrush or something. I don't know why they're brushing their hair. They just are. Is that telehealth? Let's say someone forgot what their homework is, and they send me a secure message. Is that telehealth? I've had folks ask this question. And I think that many of us do routinely have some types of communication, be they, asynchronously through email, text, secure messaging, or hopefully we're using HIPAA compliant versions of these products, or through the telephone, of course. Many of us are communicating with our clients in between scheduled sessions. And so, we have these different ways of doing it. And I think that it's valid to stop and think about, how these occur, and do we call them sort of telehealth or not. And, most often I think we're talking about the telephone, which adds another layer of complexity, in as much as it used to be if someone was calling me on the phone, they just called me on the phone and the phone rang and I picked it up. Nowadays, I get a lot of FaceTime calls from clients. They want to have like a FaceTime chat with me, because I think that's how they're calling people broadly. And, so again, I've shared in this forum that I try to use video conferencing products that are designed for healthcare, although we do have this announcement from DHHS and Office of Civil Rights that says we can use right now during COVID non-public facing video conferencing products. So technically Skype and FaceTime and these things could be permitted. My feeling generally is, why would I not use a healthcare product when I can easily? And so too, written in my informed consent document, is letting folks know that I'm not going to accept a video chat call that is in between sessions. For me, I also think it nicely differentiates the time that, somehow I like that we have our video calls when there are scheduled sessions. And if we're communicating between, we have telephone calls, and I don't know why that differentiates in my mind, but it does. So, I think there's this question of when is it telehealth? And, my feeling is I don't know, and I don't know that a person can know. So if someone is calling me and I pick up the phone, I don't know what they're going to say, of course, don't have good prognostication. It could be that they just think they left their pen in my office, or alternatively, they could be having a clinical emergency. And I think that, so for these reasons, I'm only going to answer those phone calls when I'm in an appropriate place to discuss clinical information. I'm not going to answer them in the grocery store. I'm not going to answer them in my car on Bluetooth, and that's so hard because there are times I've been waiting to talk to that client and there's something I want to say to them. But, my feeling is unless I am in a setting that is appropriate for healthcare, I'm going to let it ring because I want to be totally available to my client if they actually do have something, of significant content. I think for me, I also sort of wonder, when is it billable? So, when is it a telephone session and when is it a chitty chat? I'll mention, I generally speaking never bill unless it was scheduled. If someone gets in the routine habit of wanting longer phone contacts with me between sessions, calling to describe a clinical issue, in those circumstances, it's a clinical issue I'm going to talk about in session. And because of the way I practice, I'm probably going to start shaping them towards, not having those longer contacts unless we need to be meeting more frequently, and then we'll address meeting frequency. But I generally am trying to help people successive approximations, toward those lengthy in between calls. I have had some colleagues say that if they have a half an hour phone call, they do let folks know they are going to bill it, but they let them know at the beginning of the phone call, and that's something that's in their informed consent document. So, this is something that you really want to make sure is in your informed consent document. How do you handle in between session communications? What types of communication do you accept? Because whatever you say, prepare to have it violated. If I say, I don't accept emails, thank you, please use the secure messaging portal that's so nicely integrated into your electronic, medical record, folks are still going to find your email somehow and send you an email. If you've ever made a call from your personal phone, good chances you might receive a text on that phone sometime. And even though it may say in your informed consent document that you're not going to do that, we want to be thoughtful about what you do in that circumstance. So, my feeling is we never know whether it's going to be clinical content or administrative content. And in my mind's eye, honestly, it's an unknowable thing. It may seem like administrative content that time. Somebody calls me and says, oh, Sarah, I'm going to be 5 minutes late today. Okay. The first time it happens, that's administrative. The 15th time it happens, this starts to feel like a clinical issue to me, and I'm going to be really interested in what's going on there. Hopefully I'd have the conversation before 15. so I think it's a little bit unknowable. And so I think of it all as telehealth. I mean, from the first time I get an email from somebody, I think, and excuse me, for clinical psychologists and the American Psychological Association, they regard care as beginning once that informed consent document is signed. There are other disciplines, such as counseling psychologists, who I know think that first email is initiating care. So, there are differing opinions, but my general feeling is when somebody engages you on technology, we don't save the good stuff for later. It's not like, well, I'm not going to worry about it till later. I think of it as telehealth, from that first contact. I will say one exception is emergencies. If someone's having an emergency and they're contacting me in a way that is not the way I want them contacting me, I'm going to follow up with a phone call immediately. Whereas if they're just texting me to ask how the weather is, I might wait, I might not respond, and that might be my informed consent that I don't respond to social media requests and I don't respond to text, and I'll talk to you at your session. If it seems emergent, I'm going to be calling you on the phone immediately. So I mean, that this is sort of how I approach when it's telehealth and when it's not telehealth. This, of course, is not exclusive to telehealth. We can have these same issues with in-person care, with people contacting us between sessions. But I think in my mind, it is harder to differentiate this, because if all our contact is happening remotely, there's less of a natural division, I think, that occurs intellectually between the remote contact that is the session and the remote contact that is just checking in between sessions.
Although ironically, when we see them in person, that's the care time, yet they're using telehealth to contact us between those sessions, right?
So, during the most distressed times, and so I've always thought of telehealth as being like kind of its early adopter was in emergency medicines, like that we have used hotlines, we've been talking to our clients when they're having emergencies, so I know a lot of folks prefer not to see clients when they're in emergent circumstances over telehealth, but in my mind's eye, like, we've been doing that for a while.
Exactly. Well, those are some really thought-provoking aspects to this, because I think, again, it's really information that we have to think through well in advance of when we're practicing at all, and really rethinking what our documentation is and our consent forms and our office policy and our communications with our patients. So it's always great to review that.
Should we take another live question, Margaret?
Sure. I love this.
Yeah. I like this one a lot. Given the racism pandemic, how are you providing virtual supports for your clients of color? I think that's a wonderful question. And, in my mind's eye, the heart of telehealth, the reason I got into telehealth was access to care, was ensuring that high quality healthcare gets to our clients wherever they are, and that this isn't a practice that is siloed and only available to a narrow slice, of our community. I feel like telehealth is a tool that we can use to democratize evidence-based care and disseminate it meaningfully. And now more than ever, I feel like I live in a city where there have been restrictions on travel, and there have been all sorts of wacky stuff going on. But I think that it is harder for people to get to their health care, and this impacts communities of color even more, secondary to some of the disruption of traffic and things like that have happened. So for me, I feel like now more than ever, it is really valuable to have a tool to make sure that my clients can receive care, when they need it, and that, during a really important period of time. This is a period of time where they're, in the context of protests, in the context of a lot of people opening their eyes and having realizations regarding the pandemic of racism, that we are able to reach out and give support without risking our clients' health, and without in the context of COVID, and without risking disruption to care, for whatever reason. I think is incredibly valid. I also think there's this opportunity to use telehealth to increase my competencies as a provider. I know I'm trying to go to a lot of trainings. I'm trying to participate in consultation groups and to read as much as I can, and to be better, and to improve myself in this way. And I appreciate it's video conferencing, I guess, if I'm not talking to a client, although it's consultation, so it's still telehealth. I think in these ways, I am improving myself as a provider and doing what I can with my hands in my professional life to make impactful contributions. So I think telehealth also has this opportunity that we as professionals can be bringing on training and competencies and improving.
I agree. And I think this idea of being able to reach more, whether we're bridging a local distance because of curfew limits or travel restrictions or COVID or, challenges that folks have, and even just getting around in terms of the community not being safe at certain times. It really allows for patients to have more access, as well as access to care beyond what their perhaps local level is. And so being able to access providers with more multicultural competencies and who may have some expertise in very particular needs of for various communities. So I think this really is a time where video conferencing can, like you said, both from a care provision standpoint, but also for providers accessing educational material and competency building skills, it's huge.
And I think you raised this good point wherein we can, do a better job of, if someone would prefer to see a therapist of color, if you live in a community that is very homogenous and doesn't have as many options, that we can use telehealth to make sure folks see a provider that they want to see. I know, my daughter is a woman of color, a child. She's not a woman yet. And I think for her, she had all these distance classes, and she has commented actually about like, oh gosh, mom, like, there's so much more diversity when I visit with this class, in this town, and that class in this town. And I think it's been really valuable for her. And it's made me think a lot about how that is applicable in the telehealth milieu as well.
In the area I live, there's not a whole ton of diversity, but what I often hear from folks within a cultural community is sometimes they want to access care outside of it as well, and because it's too closed of a network. And well, sometimes I kind of think, wow, okay, like this is like a juxtaposing of positions, but it is important for folks, really being able to access the care that they feel most connected to. And that may be of, kind of similar connections, or it may be of different backgrounds and diversities as well.
I like that. I mean, getting clients the care that they want that works the best for them. And that's what telehealth's all about.
I know. Kind of related, one of the questions we had that came in before, I just thought maybe I'll jump to this, and that's a question about making sure, or how we can ensure we're practicing within our scope while we're using telehealth. And it kind of carries on, I think, right from the conversation we were just having in terms of because telehealth allows a provider to access, admittedly more broadly, of a service network or provide care to many others. And patients may be accessing you because they find you online, or they now see your practice is providing telehealth, so they might not have come in person, but they may now be kind of knocking on the video conferencing door. It's still important to make sure that the care that you're providing is the care that you're trained to provide, and that telehealth isn't necessarily it's a means of being able to provide care. It's not necessarily a whole brand new scope of practice, but it's a means in which you want to be informed and knowledgeable about as you engage in that. But again, you may have folks coming to seek services that aren't within your competency area, and it's just as important, even though they're knocking on that virtual door, that you're still maintaining what those practice parameters are that you've had for your in-person practice.
Mm-hmm. It's a great point. I had someone recently ask me to do, a full neuropsych workup for them, which I haven't done since internship, and we probably shouldn't have me doing, and they really, it took a little bit of redirection, to really get them on board with the idea that, we would need to find a separate provider. But I think there's something that feels a bit one-stop shopping about the modality.
Exactly. Yeah.
Another great question that we had this last week that I really appreciated, and I thought was one that was not uncommon. Someone wrote in talking about when there was hesitance on the client's side, or sometimes the provider's side, to provide telehealth. So, and actually they sort of contemplated who was more hesitant, the provider or the client. This one, I loved this question because I think, for me, there's sort of two facets diverge. One being where we can help our clients, particularly clients who maybe have less experience, using video conferencing or technology broadly to navigate video conferencing session. How do we address their comfort? Starting first when we're scheduling the appointment. I know when I'm doing it, I'm starting it first when I answer that first telephone call. I'm asking questions about how much do you use this technology in your life? Is this something you do day to day? Is it something you've, ever done previously? So I want to know about their prior experience. I'm interested in their willingness to learn. How are they excited about learning this? Is this a necessary evil to them? Are they dreading it? What are their concerns? And I want to address this all before I ever get them on the modality. And of course, if I think it's not a good fit, I'm never going to try to strong arm someone, into a video conferencing milieu, for example. We have great data on the telephone. So for me, I like the video conferencing. I like the additional behavioral observation data. I like seeing my client's expression. And if it's a deal breaker for them, we certainly know that the telephone is a absolutely valid way to deliver competent care. But, I'll say that I like to do, and I've talked about this in prior chats, a 5-minute test call with folks. We're not really starting about clinical issues. I usually have the informed consent before I do that test call. But the purpose of the test call is just to talk about the technology, the modality. I want them to have the experience of receiving the link for video conferencing, clicking on it, seeing what it looks like, talking a little bit about things like gaze and things like body position and having some of those conversations. I'm sorry.
Don't wear your pajamas.
Don't wear your pajamas, and don't wiggle me on your knees or I'll get really nauseated. So these little things, pick a space where your spouse isn't walking by in their bathrobe. All these things that we've talked about in prior telechats. So, I think that it's really valuable to invest the time, in advance. And there's really just no proxy for it. A former postdoc of mine who was just wonderful did some research that said the best predictive factor for telehealth adoption wasn't prior experience with technology. It wasn't educational status. It wasn't age. It wasn't all these things that people might think it was. It was the willingness of the provider to give the person a good explanation. And when they had a really good explanation, they found that there was just better adoption of the program and that all these other variables really fell away in analysis. Now I'm going to mention that, in fact, the research that I have read generally shows high rates of satisfaction among clients. Now, I want to acknowledge for telehealth, and particularly for video conferencing, and high rates of therapeutic alliance, I want to acknowledge that this research was pre-COVID, and in a COVID world, it is harder to know what those data will show, because previously this was a smaller group of people. It was circumstances where care wouldn't have happened otherwise. In the context of COVID, many people have kind of been drug along into the telehealth world. Maybe they didn't want to be. But historically, the data have suggested that clients like telehealth. However, the data also suggests that providers, we struggle. We struggle more with it and that we don't like it as much. And to me, that makes a ton of sense. There's something performative about the modality. It's fatiguing. I'm having to show up more in my face. I can't rely on looking at you. I have to ask so many questions. I feel more tired, at the end of that session than I might in person. And so the data doesn't surprise me. So, generally speaking, we talked about this previously, but I encourage providers to really engage in self-care. If you need to abbreviate your day or have shorter sessions, that might be what you need to do. I know I have compressed my schedule. So instead of seeing 3 long days, I have 5 shorter days, just so I'm not quite as much in front of a screen. I'm no longer watching TV in the evenings because I think my desiccated eyeballs will fall out of my head. So, these little self-care things we can do, I think, will help.
And like you mentioned too, Sarah, it's about still being able to have our collegial connection. And I think that's one of the things that perhaps is a piece of providers maybe not liking or preferring telehealth as much, the drain, and also, we've kind of lost our, person next door that we can just go and go and, just kind of have just a cool down moment. So, making sure you're having those space times, I think, is key as well. How are we doing with the questions?
So many. I was sneaking a peek at them.
Oh,
Shall we
maybe
ask some more?
I can't see them on my side, so I'm like.
Well, here's a few more. I have noticed that insurance carriers are paying less for a telehealth session versus a face-to-face session for the same exact procedure. What is your experience with this? And they say, thank you. That's very nice. Yes, my experience is yes. In fact, I live in a state where, although we previously did have legislation that required coverage of telehealth, in the context of COVID, there has been an executive order requiring parity for telehealth. So being reimbursed the same amount as in-person services. Now, that's wacky and specific to my state. Many states have not had that. Often, and I'd be curious what this individual's experience has been, it has been the case that the discrepancy between the two amounts has not been hugely different. So I will note that in my state, the difference is about $10. Which, don't get me wrong, I want my $10. But I think this is one of those things that insurance companies have the notion that telehealth costs the provider less. Now, most of us are maintaining a physical office in addition to doing telehealth, and that's not necessarily an accurate assumption. Additionally, we're paying for software programs with HIPAA compliance. It's an additional cost to your practice. So I find that to be something of a fallacious assumption. That being said, it is the assumption. And so it is definitely the case. I think in the context of COVID, you have a better shot at calling the insurance and saying, give me a break here. Care as usual cannot occur, and having that conversation. That being said, it is a known practice, and it's one of those things that I really encourage you, if you want to see the change, contact your legislature, contact your state psychological association, because they will have someone often in a professional role who advocates with the legislature, and let them know the issue, because to me this is a fairness issue that unfortunately it does often fall out this way. And I want to mention, I'm talking about video conferencing very consistently. If we're talking about telephone, that uses a different set of billing codes, and that is reimbursed at a considerably lower rate.
I was actually just going to bring that up, Sarah, but I appreciate you putting the plug in for folks to contact legislators. They truly are the folks that have the authority to rewrite the laws or to encourage the laws to bring the parity to those billing codes as well.
Mm-hmm. Shall I read another one of these great questions?
Fantastic.
Okay. If we get the go-ahead to return to work in our area, as long as we adhere to the CDC guidelines, why do we need to justify and document the necessity for each client? I think this is a great question, and I think it's a nice sort of analog of how it used to be for telehealth. I think it used to be the case that when you did a telehealth session, you had to document for each case, why am I doing telehealth when in-person care is the standard of care? Or that might be an overstatement, but is what most folks are doing anyway, among standard practices. And I think now it is the inverse. I mean, generally speaking, my feeling is it is a good risk management tool for your practice. To me, it is much like other informed consent issues we do. For example, it makes a lot of logical common sense to me that if a client just missed a session with me, that they would be financially liable for it. And I have found that people have been very surprised by that information, and so it's one of those things that I have in my informed consent document. I explicitly talk with folks about, so too, I want folks to think about the risks. I may, because I think each of us are going to be determining our own risk benefit analysis of doing telehealth in our practical lives, of course, as professionals, but also in our personal lives. And then, alternatively, do we want to do in-person care? So I think you may live in a jurisdiction where you are permitted to go back into the office, but for whatever reason, you may determine that you're not going to. If you're in a high risk category or someone in your immediate family is, you may decide that that's not something you want to do. And that's your choice, and certainly something you want to be thoughtful about. I think to me, the informed consent, so the trust has a great template I'm going to mention for informed consent for returning to in-person care that it's recommended we get. And Margot and I would recommend that we get this for our clients as we return to care. And my feeling is it's a forcing function for an analogous process. One, that they are being thoughtful about the risks they're taking, that they've engaged in, they've decided for themselves, and two, that you're updating them and letting them know what to expect. So, I want my client to know that if they come see me, For example, when I return to in-person care, I'm going to be following the guidelines of the American Psychological Association and the Trust, and I'm going to be wearing a face covering. And I want them to know that. I'm going to be having them not wait in my waiting room. They're going to text me using a secure text program from their car. I'm going to come up for their session that way. I want them to know that. I'm going to be maintaining social distance from folks. And so, I mean, I wasn't hugging them before, but I want them to know that the reason I'm walking so far away, that's what we're going to do. And in that way, I think that they can make a choice, knowing the facts of what they would be getting, when they come to see me in person, and they can determine what the right choice is for them. So that's my best stab at that. I wonder, Margot, what would you add?
Well, I think what you're highlighting is in-person care will have changed. It's not going to be the old normal. It's going to have some new normal aspects to it and some steps before we get back to the old normal, if that ever happens. I think a couple other pieces that I would mention is there are some models and some folks suggesting that this may be, we return to some in-person care, but it may stop again, and we may be returning back to video conferencing. And so the idea here is thinking through how this would change your practice back and forth, potentially. I think the other reason is really, again, kind of a risk management tool for the providers, that you're really having some thoughtful conversations and considerations about why you would be coming back into the office, even though the government is saying, okay, yeah, sure, you can do that. The government tells us we can do a lot of things, but sometimes it's not what's best for that situation or that circumstance or that particular patient. And so we want to be mindful that this is really an individual patient, individual provider perspective. And again, I wanted to kind of wrap back to something that we talked about way at the beginning, and just to highlight part of that documentation of coming back into the office. I would echo just encouraging folks, if folks are seeing patients outside of the office, that you're still documenting where your patient is located at the time of that service from what they're telling you. You can't know for sure, obviously, but you can ask them where they are, if it's safe, what jurisdiction they're in, because without that information in your documentation, that's going to have some challenging considerations in terms of some of the billing ramifications, et cetera. So I just want to remind folks about that.